With the multitude of fighting games that were released on the PlayStation, we have a varying mix of good, in-between and not so good titles. I don't want to say that they're bad because I genuinely don't like to be negative around games, but there are ones out there that are lower quality, but in some regards are lesser known to many. But every game has something distinct to offer that will provide an experience that you usually won't get anywhere else. Some people will enjoy it, some people won't. Some of these experiences are quite simplistic, while others are more advanced and have more details and features attributed to them. And funnily enough, in Japan, there was a ridiculous amount of fighting games that were released in that region that many of us, even to this day, still know really nothing about or know anything about at all. And one of the games in question that we are looking at here is Battle Master. Now, for many, if you go searching online, there's very, very little information available for the game. And in most cases, if you try to do a Google search, more than likely you're going to be met with a variety of names of other similar games that use the same name as such, with Gundam the Battle Master. That's primarily what will show up. Now, there will be a few instances where the game will show up, but it's very, very hard to find. But this was a fighting game that was released in 1998 in Japan only, that tries to take a different approach to your typical fighting games within the genre itself. But straight away from the get-go, you can instantly tell that the quality of this game is nowhere near as good as games like the Tekken series, Mortal Kombat, and most of the heavy hitters that popularised the system. If anything, from any sort of information that you can find online, the ratings are usually quite low, to say the least. Now, the game does give you access to fight as different characters, and it even has the option to use various machines or robots. But when you first enter into the game, you're primarily fighting with human characters, and they all have their own different characteristics and special moves. But it takes a while to get into the game because the UI, or the options menu, to figure out is very, very daunting and very confusing. And in many ways, it's hard to really know what to do in order to get a game started. I found myself personally, when trying to set it up, it took ages to figure out what to do. Now, I know because it's Japanese, there is a language barrier involved, but it's not as straightforward as it should be. If anything, it's just too difficult and overly confusing, and that will put you off straight away. But once you do get into a game, that's where the main differences will become apparent, especially if you compare it to your typical fighting games. As yes, the game is in 3D, but it plays from a 2D perspective. And graphically, considering this game came out in 1998, at that point we already had the likes of the Tekken series, and Tekken 3 was released during that year as well, which is pretty much the best fighting game on the PlayStation, and one of the best fighting games of all time. And this game really doesn't stack up with its visual quality, but even its fighting mechanics, as it's very simplistic. There's a very limited array of moves available. You'll find yourself nearly just button bash, and it does give you some instances of certain combinations that you can use and the buttons to press, but you'll find yourself always using the same combinations again, and it will come down to sheer luck in most cases, especially when you're starting out, to defeat enemies, because if you're just using standard punches and kicks, you will never defeat your opponents, as they will also farm the same moves over and over again, and sometimes they have such a long reach that you can't even get near them, and they'll hit you so many times before you can even get a hit in yourself. So they will have done so much damage to you that the fight is pretty much over from the get-go. So that can lead to a lot of frustration, and it's a pity when you think about it, because games being released during that time, at this stage the PlayStation had already been out in Japan for over 4 years, and yet this game here feels like it was released during the early days of the console's lifespan, and if anything, it would have been more suited to that period. If this was an early game released on the PlayStation, it probably would have done or fared a little bit better. But the fact is, this was released 4 years into that stage, leaves a lot of questions to be asked or answered in many cases. I suppose when we look at it, because there's very little information about the game online, if anything, it's kind of a case that you just have to put it down to your own experience. If you can manage to figure out how the game operates and get into a couple of matches, you will just have to base your opinions off of the time you spent playing it. Now, it's not the worst game I've ever played, but it's most certainly not the best, and there's just a lot of questions around the use of certain features. But for a game that came out in 1998, even I will be honest, it could have been and should have been a lot better. So it's hard to really know the processes behind the game's development, or even the company itself, as very little information is even known about the development team behind this game. It could have been one of their first ever games on the PlayStation for all we know. And that's also another thing as well, is a lot of games that did appear on the system were only developed by small companies, or that might have only released maybe one game, if any, on the system at all. So there's always that variation in terms of quality regards to the games that are being developed. But unfortunately that's just the way things are, and even at that, they're still like that even today. So it is what it is. It has some interesting quirks in what it's trying to do, but it just could have been so much better in most regards. But I would love to know your thoughts on this if you have played it yourself, and what do you think of it overall. So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of fighting games released on the PlayStation, similar to this, then you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.